The Mitchell's Front Page podcast is brought to you by Geelong Bank. Listen live on 94.7 The Pulse, Mondays and Tuesdays from 9 till 11.
Kim Seeling Smith, good morning.
Good morning, Mitchell. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Something that has captured my attention is you've been having a conversation about Gen Y and millennials, and I'm part of Gen Y. I'm a millennial, so I'm really interested in this aspect. What are we learning about Gen Y and millennials as increasingly they're entering the workforce and they're kind of leaving their mark on companies? How different are they to generations before them?
Well, it's interesting because now not only do we have the millennials in the workforce, we've got a new generation, the Gen Zs. And interestingly enough, even though they are similar in age, they're very different. So the Gen Ys, or the millennials as they're now being called, they were raised on technology, but they weren't raised from very, very small like the Gen Zs are. So it's a little bit different. But what that is causing both generations is because we can pick up our phones and get answers to absolutely anything very, very quickly. Both generations have become used to instant gratification and instant answers to questions. So if they're in a workplace and people have to think about their answers, which is very relevant sometimes, it can cause a bit of tension between the younger generations.
What do the older generations think of the younger generations? Because I've always said this, I feel like Gen Y gets put under a lot of pressure and is generally disliked. But I feel like some of the heat is actually going off Gen Y now and being pushed onto Gen Z and Gen Alpha. I feel like it's always the newest kid on the block that is scrutinized.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong. I mean, we've been talking about Gen Ys and then millennials for the last, last 15 years now. And you're right. They have been scrutinized. And I think they've been scrutinized even more than previous generations because of social media. And a lot of the scrutiny is unfair, quite frankly, because the Gen Ys or millennials have the reputation for wanting not only instant gratification, as I just talked about, but instant, they're known for wanting to become a CEO overnight. And that is a little bit unfair. Yes, they are very ambitious, but if you sit down and talk to them about where they want to go, what they want to do, and what they need to do to get there, as long as they've got goals to shoot for, that can be very, very beneficial. So it's a matter of, regardless what the generation is, it's a matter of sitting down and talking to them as individuals and understanding what their individual needs are. So it's been a long time since I've entered the fray into generational differences because my philosophy has really been, yes, there are differences, but at the end of the day, if we treat them as human beings instead of assets, and we get to know them, we get to understand them, we have really good conversations with them and manage their expectations, then it doesn't matter what generation they come from. So regardless of the generation, I think the real paradigm shift is treating individuals as individuals. And let's face it, our organizations are not set up that way.
What a novel concept, and quite straightforward really to understand that everyone is different and to treat people individually. But it's actually very hard to find out there in the real world.
Yes, absolutely it is. Our people practices were developed hundreds of years ago, and they were developed for a very different workforce, a workforce that didn't have to think or be creative or solve problems, a workforce where compliance and control ruled the day. Because if you think about it, it makes sense. We brought kids off the farms and put them in factories, and they needed routines and checklists and processes. But more and more, especially in the last 20 years, as automation and AI, your last speaker was talking about AI, automation and AI takes over those routine, tactical, those dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs. We need our people to think with a different part of their brain. So it's time for us to think really critically about updating our people practices, because yesterday's ways of hiring and managing staff just don't cut it for today's workforce, regardless of what generation they're in.
And everyone says, and you've touched on it as well, that Gen Y is a very driven generation. I think that's probably right, given the people that I talk to and the people my age that I know.
Yes.
Do you think for the most part that is more beneficial than not, to be driven and to have ambitions and to set goals?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that the Gen Ys and millennials have been really unfairly painted with, a bad brush, because some of the very things that drive us crazy about Gen Ys in the workforce are the very things that, if we can harness, will help us succeed, like that being goal-driven, like that achievement orientation. We just have to manage them differently or work with them differently. We have to collaborate with them. Now, what's interesting is that what the research is now showing is that Gen Ys and millennials are very collaborative. Gen Zs are more competitive because of how the television they were raised on. I mean, they've competed for everything from a mate to, building a house or renovating.
Yes, cooking.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. So I think one of the real interesting tensions that managers have to resolve is how to fold in a competitive generation into a collaborative workforce, because the workforce has to be collaborative. Now, again, I think that that's down to working with people as individuals, figuring out what they need to be successful, managing their expectations, and providing that learning and growth opportunity. And if we do that, we can be successful, and we can attract and retain the right people that we need to overcome the challenges that we're going to continue to face as businesses because of technology, because of the global competitive forces that we're operating against, and these things like bushfires and coronavirus and things that are really having significant impact. We need people to be goal-oriented. We need people to be ambitious. We need people to think outside the square.
Well, thank you for being on the program this morning. Hopefully we'll catch up with you again when there's another HR topic that comes up, but I really appreciate your expertise.
I welcome it, Mitchell. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kim Seeling Smith there, an expert on all things to do with the workplace, human resources and the future of work.
The Mitchell's Front Page podcast is brought to you by Geelong Bank. Listen live on 94.7 The Pulse, Mondays and Tuesdays from 9 till 11. Or search for Mitchell's Front Page on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or wherever you get your podcasts.